Arrogant judge finds elderly man in court, then is shocked to learn he's a law professor. The courtroom was packed, not with people seeking justice, but with those seeking spectacle. The air buzzed with murmurs, shifting feet, and the occasional stifled cough. Every eye was fixed on the front of the room, where a tall, sleek young man in a polished black robe presided over the bench. Judge Grant Stafford, the city's youngest federal judge, was known more for his theatrics than his wisdom. His gavel wasn't a symbol of justice, it was a hammer of intimidation. And standing before him, barely reaching the podium, was a frail old man with deep, dark skin and silver gray hair slicked back neatly. Elijah Monroe. He didn't look like a man capable of disrupting a courtroom. His tweed jacket hung loosely on his narrow frame. His fingers trembled slightly as they rested on the wooden edge of the stand. But behind the age and modest appearance, his eyes told another story, clear, steady, unflinching. They were eyes that had seen too much and endured even more. Stafford tapped the gavel once loud, sharp, deliberate. Silence fell like a curtain. "Mr. Monroe," Judge Stafford began, his voice dripping with smug authority, "you are hereby fined $800 for illegal parking in a restricted zone." Gasps rippled through the room like electricity. $800 for a parking violation? Elijah looked up, his brow furrowed. "Your Honor," he said, voice calm, respectful, "I don't mean to dispute the law, but may I explain?" "No, you may not," Stafford cut in. His lips curled into a thin, condescending smile. "You had 5 minutes, Mr. Monroe. 5 minutes late is 5 minutes breaking the law. What's next? Should we excuse armed robbery because someone was hungry?" Laughter rippled from a few spectators, but it quickly faded. Even they knew the comparison was grotesque. Elijah took a breath, slow and deliberate. "I wasn't late out of carelessness, sir. I had just picked up my grandson from the hospital. He'd had a seizure at school. There was no space in the emergency lot, and I didn't want to leave him alone. I parked outside the restricted area at 3:55 p.m. The sign said no parking after 4. I was back at 4:03. 3 minutes. Stafford stood slowly, descending from his bench like a vulture closing in. He walked across the courtroom, each step echoing against the polished marble. He stopped just inches from Elijah, looming over him. "Oh," he said, feigning sympathy. "So we should bend the law for you because you had a personal emergency?" Elijah didn't flinch. "No, Your Honor. I'm only asking for reason." "Reason?" Stafford laughed, shaking his head. "The law doesn't bend for feelings, Mr. Monroe. It doesn't make exceptions for old age or sob stories. You're lucky I'm not citing you for obstruction." Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "This is cruel." But Stafford didn't care. He returned to his bench and slammed the gavel again. $800, payable immediately. This case is closed." Elijah stood motionless for a long moment. The room watched, breath held, expecting him to protest, to raise his voice, to shout at the outrageous injustice. But he didn't. Instead, he reached slowly into the inner pocket of his worn coat and pulled out an old faded wallet. With trembling hands, he unfolded it and counted out the cash. 5 $100 bills, then 3 20s and 2 10s. The last 20 he hesitated on, his fingers lingered as if parting with it hurt more than he let on. Then he placed the money gently on the podium, one bill at a time, like a man laying down an offering to a system that had long ago stopped serving him. Stafford didn't even look at him. He waved toward the bailiff, signaling for the next case. But Elijah didn't move. He just stood there, shoulders square, back straight, staring ahead, not at Stafford, but through him. Not angry, not afraid, just steady. The silence in the room grew thick. A young woman sitting in the back shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A man in a worn suit shook his head in disbelief. Even the court reporter paused for a second before returning to her keyboard. What they were witnessing wasn't just a fine. It wasn't just another case. It was a public humiliation. It was a show trial meant to remind everyone that the law didn't protect, it punished, and today it had chosen an old man with a quiet voice and kind eyes as its target. Elijah finally turned, stepping slowly away from the podium. He didn't hunch. He didn't shuffle. He walked with the dignity of someone who had once stood tall in rooms filled with power and who refused to let this moment take that away from him. As he passed the rows of wooden benches, he caught eyes with a young man, Daniel Cruz, a lawyer fresh out of law school, attending court that day to observe. Their gazes met for less than a second, but in that second, Daniel saw something that shook him. The moment Daniel Cruz saw the old man's face, something inside him cracked. He had come to court that morning expecting the usual routine motions, tired legal jargon, an afternoon of dull observation. But what he got instead was a gut punch to everything he believed in. The man fined $800 for a 3-minute parking violation, the one who stood tall, dignified, silent in the face of humiliation. That man was no ordinary citizen. That man was him, Elijah Monroe. The name alone once shook courtrooms across the South. He wasn't just a judge. He was a force, a symbol, a black man in a black robe who had dared to wield justice in a system designed to crush his kind. And Daniel had once worshipped him. 20 years earlier, a frightened, angry boy had sat in the back of a courtroom, watching his older brother wrongly accused of assault about to be swallowed by the machine. Public defender asleep at the table, DA confident with his rigged evidence. But then a calm, firm voice spoke from the bench. It cut through the noise like a blade. The judge called out the inconsistencies, demanded answers, and ultimately dismissed the case with the words, "This court will not be a tool of injustice." That judge was Elijah Monroe. That moment changed Daniel's life. It gave him purpose. It taught him that the law could be more than just a weapon, it could be a shield. And now, 2 decades later, he had just watched the same man be treated like trash for doing nothing wrong. He had to know why. Daniel tracked Elijah down just outside the courthouse. "Sir Judge Monroe?" Elijah stopped, eyes narrowing. "That name doesn't belong to me anymore." "Yes, it does," Daniel said, breathless. "You saved my brother, and you changed me. I became a lawyer because of you." The older man sighed, his shoulders heavy. "Then I'm sorry, son, because you chose a path paved with betrayal." And so, under the gray sky, the truth began to pour out. Elijah Monroe had been a superior court judge in the Deep South, and unlike others, he didn't play politics. He overturned wrongful convictions. He dismissed coerced confessions. He challenged the racial biases that everyone else ignored. And for a while, he was unstoppable, until he went too far. He cleared 3 black teenagers of a murder they didn't commit against the furious will of the DA, the police chief, and the wealthy family demanding blood. Elijah didn't care. He ruled by the evidence, and the evidence screamed innocence. Within weeks, the machine began to grind him down. First came the headlines, "Judge goes soft on crime." Then the whispers, "Where's all that community grant money going?" Then the investigation manufactured charges of financial mismanagement, front-page accusations, a firestorm of lies. "They didn't want to destroy me," Elijah told Daniel. "They wanted to erase me." And they did. He was forced to resign, his record sealed in shame. No trial, no hearing, just silence. The kind of silence that buries reputations alive. "Why didn't you fight?" Daniel asked, voice shaking. "Because they would have dragged every case I ever touched through the mud," Elijah replied. "They'd reopen verdicts, ruin the lives of people I protected. I had to disappear to keep their justice intact." And so he vanished. No interviews, no rebuttals, no memoirs, just 20 years of exile in plain sight. Daniel looked at him, this man who had once stood tall above injustice, now reduced to a ghost among the living, and felt something ignite deep inside. "You can't stay hidden," he said. "They're still doing it, Judge. They're still hurting people. You matter. Your voice matters." Elijah didn't answer. Not right away. But the injustice Elijah faced that day was only the surface of something far darker, something systemic. And Daniel Cruz, driven by a fire that refused to be extinguished, knew he couldn't walk away. Not when the very man who humiliated Elijah was quietly building an empire of oppression behind the bench. The rain hammered against the diner windows like a warning. Inside, Daniel Cruz sat across from Elijah Monroe. Both men hunched over a chipped formica table in the farthest booth, away from prying eyes. Between them sat a thin manila folder, its edges curled, its contents damning. You need to see this, Daniel said, his voice low but urgent. He pushed the folder forward. Elijah didn't move. His arms were crossed, his eyes locked on the storm outside, as if debating whether the fire he buried decades ago was worth reigniting. Daniel leaned in. His name is Grant Stafford. You already saw what he did to you for a parking ticket, but that's nothing compared to what he's doing behind closed doors. That got Elijah's attention. He slowly turned, took the folder, and flipped it open. Inside were court transcripts, sentencing records, and data points Daniel had spent weeks compiling. Every document painted the same picture. Judge Stafford was a rising star in the legal system, praised for his strict interpretation of the law. But when the numbers were laid bare, a darker truth emerged. 80% of his maximum sentences go to defendants of color, Daniel said, his voice tightening. 80, Elijah. People with no priors. People with public defenders who barely know their names. Elijah flipped through the sheets, eyes narrowing. 10 years for petty theft. A $100 fine turned into a 6-month sentence because the defendant couldn't pay on time? Daniel nodded grimly. He turns the courtroom into a trap. Can't afford the fine. You get jail. Late to court because your bus broke down. Bench warrant. Argue for leniency? He doubles the sentence. And the worst part? He leaned closer. Every excessive fine, every bloated fee, it all feeds into a community enforcement fund managed by his brother's private consulting firm. Elijah's gaze lifted. He profits off every life he breaks. Exactly. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Elijah closed the folder, rested his hands on it, and exhaled. I warned you, he said quietly. You chose the wrong war. Daniel shook his head. Number Y chose the right one. I just can't fight it alone. Outside, thunder rolled. Elijah stared at his reflection in the rain-streaked window. For years, he had watched the world decay from the shadows, refusing to step back into the fire. But now the flames had found him. Again. You saw what happened to me, Elijah said. They didn't just take my job. They took my name, my history, my legacy. And now you want me to step into that again? I want you to help me stop him, Daniel replied. This man is everything you stood against. He's a tyrant with a robe and a pen, and no one's stopping him because they're afraid. Elijah turned back to the folder, fingers drumming slowly against the cover. I buried this part of me for a reason. Daniel didn't flinch. Then unearth it. Because if you don't, no one will. The people he's crushing, they don't have names big enough to fight back. But yours, your name still carries weight, even buried. The old judge's eyes sharpened. You think one man can bring down a corrupt system? Daniel answered without hesitation. Number. But I think one man can spark the fire that does. The lights flickered as thunder cracked again. Elijah stood slowly. You'll need proof. Real proof. Daniel reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive. Already started. Sentencing patterns, financial trails, client testimonies. But I don't have the access you used to have. I don't know how to dig deeper. Elijah stared at the drive, then took it. When this start, he said, voice hard as steel, you can't turn back. Daniel stood too. I'm not here to turn back. And in that rain-soaked diner, 2 men, one burned by the system, the other still fighting to survive it, sealed a silent pact. The war had just begun. The deeper they dug, the dirtier it got. At first, it was just a hunch, a pattern in sentencing that didn't sit right with Daniel. But with Elijah's eye for legal detail and Daniel's access to digital records, the truth began to unearth itself like a corpse clawing its way out of a shallow grave. Judge Grant Stafford wasn't just issuing harsh sentences. He was running a business disguised as justice. They uncovered a legal relief initiative, a nonprofit supposedly created to help low-income defendants access legal aid. On paper, it looked noble. Press releases boasted about community outreach and defense support. It even received public funding and corporate donations. But when Elijah examined the tax filings and cross-referenced payments from Stafford's courtroom, the lies began to unravel. The nonprofit was a front nothing more than a laundering funnel. Nearly every defendant fined in Stafford's court had their payments rerouted through the fund. And the man overseeing the organization? Richard Stafford, Grant's older brother. a former Wall Street consultant turned community advocate. In reality, Richard was a master of shell companies, fake invoices, and offshore accounts. He took in thousands in court fees and donations and pushed them out the back door to private entities he controlled. "This isn't negligence," Elijah muttered one night, papers scattered across his dining table. "This is organized theft wrapped in a robe." Daniel stared at the figures, the transactions, the timelines. "And the state's letting it happen." "They're not just letting it happen," Elijah said. "They're helping it stay buried." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. So he did what no young lawyer was supposed to do. He published the truth. His article hit the internet like a lightning bolt. "Justice for Sale: How One Judge Turned the Courtroom into a Laundromat." Within hours, it was trending. But exposing the truth came at a cost far greater than either of them had prepared for, because in a city where justice was for sale, telling the truth wasn't just dangerous. It was a declaration of war, and the system was ready to strike back. It began the morning after the report dropped. Daniel Cruz had barely slept. His article, "Justice for Sale: The Stafford Scheme," had gone viral overnight. The downloads had spiked into the thousands. Whistleblowers were already reaching out. Anonymous tips, court clerks, former interns. The whole rotten machine was starting to shake. He walked into his office expecting hell. What he got was silence. His keycard no longer worked. The security guard, who used to nod at him every morning, avoided his eyes. Upstairs, the door to the firm's glass-walled conference room was shut tight. His photo was being taken down from the wall inside. By noon, he received the email. "Your employment has been terminated effective immediately. Breach of confidentiality, damage to firm reputation. No exit interview, no farewell." Just like that, Daniel Cruz was erased. He sat in his car, gripping the wheel, jaw clenched so hard his teeth hurt. But he wasn't shocked. He'd expected it. Maybe not this fast, but retaliation always came fast when you struck a nerve. What he didn't expect was the phone call, a blocked number. He answered. "Shut your mouth or we'll shut it for you." Click. No voice, no name. Just a threat as cold as steel. Later that night, as Daniel walked home, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow stretched too far. Every passing car moved too slow. He gripped his bag tighter and picked up his pace. Elsewhere in the city, the first hit came fast, too fast for a man Elijah's age to react. He just stepped out of the corner store, a loaf of bread in one hand and a newspaper in the other, when a black SUV screeched around the corner without headlights. The engine growled low like a predator stalking prey. Elijah glanced up, instinct sharp despite the years, but not sharp enough. The door flew open. 3 masked men surged toward him. The first punch split his lip. The second cracked into his ribs. The newspaper fluttered from his hand like a white flag, but there would be no surrender. Elijah stumbled backward, hitting the pavement hard, his cane skidding across the concrete. He reached for it, but a boot came down, hard on his wrist. "You should have stayed in the shadows, old man," one of them growled. Another leaned close, voice dripping with venom. "Keep poking around, and next time, we won't leave you breathing." Elijah didn't speak. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. A final kick to the gut, and they were gone, vanishing into the night as fast as they came. The SUV's tires screamed as it disappeared around the corner, swallowed by the dark. Elijah lay there for a moment, blood pooling at the corner of his mouth, chest heaving, bones screaming. But his eyes were burning, not with fear, with fury. Across the city, Daniel Cruz stood in his kitchen, boiling water for tea. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. His laptop blinked softly in the corner, a new draft of their investigation still open. The story was growing, reaching people. But so were the threats. He had just turned toward the stove when the window shattered. The explosion hit like a fist made of fire. 1 second silence, the next an inferno. The blast tore through the living room, flames devouring the curtains in an instant. The heat was blinding, suffocating. Smoke curled around Daniel's throat like a noose as he dropped to the floor, coughing, crawling toward the hallway. He could barely see. The fire roared behind him like it was alive. Wood cracked, glass shattered. He reached for the front door, but flames licked the walls, forcing him back. Gasping, lungs screaming, he turned toward the window. Second floor. No time to think. He braced, then hurled a chair through the glass, shattering it with a desperate crash. He climbed up onto the sill as flames scorched his back and jumped. He hit the ground hard, shoulder first, the impact sending shockwaves of pain through his body. But he was alive, bloodied, burned but alive. From the street, neighbors screamed, phones out, sirens in the distance. Daniel looked up at the window as fire swallowed the place he called home. They hadn't sent a message this time. They'd sent a warning. We can erase you too. An hour later, Daniel sat in Elijah's living room, a blood-stained towel pressed against his arm, smoke still clinging to his clothes. Elijah, bruised and limping, poured him a glass of whiskey with a trembling hand. You all right? Elijah asked, his voice hoarse from bruised ribs. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Define all right. They sat in silence, the room dark except for the glow of a single lamp. They hit you too, Daniel said finally. Elijah nodded. 3 of them. Quick, brutal, practiced. They didn't want to kill me, just warn me. Daniel's jaw clenched. They tried to kill me. Elijah met his eyes. Then we're getting close. Daniel stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. Close to what? Proving corruption? We already have. And what did it get us? A firebombed apartment and a broken jaw. Elijah didn't flinch. You're angry. Good. Use it. Daniel spun around. I lost everything. No, Elijah said, voice hardening. They want you to think that. That's the fear talking. That's the system roaring, trying to make you small. Daniel exhaled, fists clenched. This isn't justice. No, Elijah said, standing with effort, ribs aching. This is war. He walked over to a dusty cabinet in the corner, unlocked it, pulled out a box. Inside, files. Old files. Blackmail. Whistleblowers. Hidden truths he'd never had the chance to use. They buried me once, he said, placing the box on the table. But they never took what I knew. Daniel stared at the files, then at Elijah. You kept all this? Elijah nodded. Because I always knew the day would come when someone would be brave or foolish enough to finish what I started. The younger man swallowed hard, eyes burning with something between fear and determination. We exposed them, Daniel said. All of them. Elijah smiled grimly. And this time, we don't ask for permission. Outside, the wind howled through the alley like a warning. But inside, the fire that tried to silence them had only made them louder. They weren't just survivors now. They were a reckoning. But just as the walls around Grant's empire began to crack, the system struck back with brutal precision this time, not with fists or fire, but with lies sharp enough to destroy a man's legacy in a single headline. The knock came at 6:17 a.m. Elijah Monroe had just poured himself a cup of black coffee, his ribs still sore from the alleyway beating. The sky outside was barely gray, the street quiet. He thought it was Daniel, maybe news about the next leak, the next piece of the puzzle. But when he opened the door, it wasn't justice waiting on the porch. It was a warrant. 2 officers in plain clothes stood with blank expressions and rigid postures. One held up a badge. The other held cuffs. Elijah Monroe, the taller one said, you're under arrest for embezzlement and financial fraud, specifically the unlawful transfer of $350,000 from the Monroe Law Scholarship Fund into a series of offshore accounts registered in the Cayman Islands. Elijah didn't blink. He didn't speak. For a full second, the silence between them screamed. Then he set down the coffee and calmly extended his wrists. No need for theatrics, he said. Let's go. They cuffed him anyway. By noon, it was everywhere. Disgraced former judge busted for embezzlement. The hypocrite behind the robe, Elijah Monroe's secret life of theft. Justice for sale? Ex-judge stole from students in need. Cable news ran the story on repeat. A former moral icon now exposed as a fraud. Old courtroom photos of Elijah were plastered side by side with blurry shots of him in handcuffs. Anchors didn't ask if it was true, they asked how long he'd been hiding it. Daniel Cruz nearly broke his phone in half. He was in the back of a cab when he saw the news alert. His heart sank. Not because he believed it, but because he knew exactly what this meant. The machine had struck back, and it had done so with surgical precision. He called Elijah's number. No answer. He called every station he could think of, finally locating the precinct where Elijah was being held. They wouldn't let him speak, wouldn't confirm whether Elijah had even requested counsel. "I'm his lawyer," Daniel snapped. "You're not listed on the K," came the reply. "And unless you're bringing a legal team with real power behind it, don't waste your time." Daniel hung up and drove to the courthouse. He called 3 criminal defense attorneys on the way. All 3 declined. The first said he was too busy. The second paused when he heard Elijah's name, then hung up. The third? He laughed. "Cruz, listen to me," the man said, voice cold. "I'm not about to stick my neck out for a man Grant Stafford once buried. You think this is a coincidence? This isn't law. It's a message." Daniel slammed his fist against the dashboard. By the time he reached the courthouse, a mob of reporters was already circling the steps like vultures. Cameras, microphones, shouting. He pushed through, face hidden under a hood. Inside, Elijah sat alone in an interview room, his hands still cuffed, his eyes shadowed but calm. Daniel was finally allowed inside after hours of waiting and paperwork. "I'm sorry," he said, breathless, as he sat across from him. "I'm trying to get anyone to represent you." Elijah gave a faint smile. "You're here. That's enough." "No, it's not," Daniel snapped. "They're pinning something on you that you didn't do. And the worst part? People believe it. They're calling you a thief, a liar. Everything you stood for, gone," Elijah finished. "Just like that." Daniel nodded, jaw tight. "And no one will take the case. They're all afraid of Stafford." The metal door clanged shut behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. Elijah Monroe stood motionless in the center of the holding cell, his hands still cuffed. The harsh, fluorescent lights above, casting long, skeletal shadows across the cracked floor. Around him, the scent of sweat, rust, and institutional despair clung to the air like mold. They hadn't even bothered giving him a proper jumpsuit. He still wore the same tweed jacket from the day of his arrest, now rumpled, stained, and marked with ink from his fingerprinting. A guard shoved a thin mattress onto the cot behind him. "Make yourself comfortable, Monroe," he muttered. "You'll be here a while." Elijah said nothing. He simply sat, slow and deliberate, his old bones aching with the weight of 71 years, and now the added weight of disgrace. At first he tried to hold on to his dignity. He reminded himself this was all a setup, that Daniel was out there fighting, that the truth would prevail. He tried to keep his back straight, his gaze firm, as he had in the courtroom all those years. But the longer he sat in that cage, the more the world outside began to shift. It started with the guards. Some recognized him immediately, not with respect, no, with amusement. One leaned in with a cruel smile. "Didn't you used to be somebody?" Another laughed. "Judge Monroe, huh? Funny how the mighty fall." Then came the whispers from other inmates. Not the usual threats, but something worse. Pity. Disbelief. "That's him," someone murmured. "Didn't he give my brother a second chance?" "I thought he was one of the good ones." "Guess not. They're all the same." And finally, the ultimate betrayal, the faces from the past. 3 days in, Elijah was allowed into the common area under close supervision. He sat in silence, eyes scanning the old television in the corner that played a looping news broadcast about his arrest. The anchor's voice dripped with venom. Once hailed as a symbol of integrity in the justice system, former Judge Elijah Monroe now faces charges of embezzling hundreds of thousands from a legal scholarship fund bearing his own name. Prosecutors are calling it the most egregious betrayal of public trust in a decade. Then came the guest panel, former colleagues, students, legal experts. And that's when the real pain began. He saw Charles Winthrop, a former clerk who once stood proudly beside him in every photo op, now shaking his head on national TV. "I admire Judge Monroe," Winthrop said solemnly. "But if these allegations are true, then everything I believed about justice was a lie." Then came Linda Park, one of Elijah's former protégés, her voice trembling, not with outrage, but shame. "He taught me to believe in the law," she said. "Now I don't know what to believe." Each word pierced deeper than any fist. They didn't even wait for the verdict. They had already judged him. Elijah's hands trembled. He stared down at them, remembering the days those very fingers signed orders that freed the innocent, defended the voiceless. Now those same hands were branded with ink and suspicion. He was no longer the man they wrote about in law journals. He was no longer the symbol carved in stone at City Hall. He was a name wrapped in scandal, a hypocrite, a thief, a fraud. The shame crept in slowly like smoke under a locked door. It seeped into his lungs, into his chest, coiling around his heart. Maybe he should have stayed gone. Maybe his exile had been mercy. Because this was humiliation dressed as justice. That night, he couldn't sleep. The cell felt colder, smaller, the walls pressed in tighter. He thought of Daniel, out there somewhere, trying to fix the unfixable, risking everything. And for what? For him. A washed-up relic the world had already buried once and was now eager to bury again. Elijah stared at the cracked ceiling, his vision blurring. He had always believed in truth. In the system, broken as it was, he'd fought from within, refused to back down, lost everything once to protect what little dignity he had left. But now he wasn't just fighting the system, he was drowning in it. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead, don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. But even as Elijah languished behind bars, branded a criminal by the world, Daniel refused to let the truth die. The breakthrough came at 2:14 a.m. Daniel Cruz sat in the back of a dingy basement office, lit only by two flickering monitors and the pale blue glow of a cracked laptop screen. Next to him sat Max, 23, hoodie up, eyes bloodshot from hours of coding. Max wasn't just a hacker. He was one of Elijah's former students, and he was furious. "This isn't just fraud," Max muttered, fingers flying across the keyboard. "It's identity fabrication. Every one of those offshore transfers tied to Elijah's name was made using a ghost identity." Daniel leaned in. "What do you mean, ghost?" "I mean, whoever did this didn't just fake Elijah's signature. They built an entire digital trail. IP addresses, device fingerprints, timestamps. It's all designed to look legit until you know where to look." Max paused, then tapped the screen. Right there, every login, every transfer was made from the same VPN node in Belarus. Same machine, same time zone. And get this, Elijah was in the hospital with pneumonia when the first transfer went through. Daniel's heart kicked against his ribs. "Can you prove it?" Max nodded grimly. "Already building the packet, but we're going to need someone on the inside to verify this chain of custody." That's when the door creaked open and a third figure entered, Sasha Wynn, a former finance major turned whistleblower who had interned at the very bank that handled the transfer. Her eyes were wide, her voice tight. "I know who authorized the account," she said. "And it wasn't Elijah Monroe. It was a fake client profile signed off by a senior bank officer, my boss. I flagged it once. The next day, my desk was cleared and my login was revoked." Daniel stepped forward. "Can you testify?" She hesitated. "I want to, but someone's been following me. Yesterday, a guy in a black SUV waited outside my apartment for 3 hours. Last night, I found my cat poisoned on my porch. I'm not crazy, Daniel. They're watching me." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Then we get you out. Now." 2 hours later, the city slept. But Daniel, Max, and Sasha moved like shadows through its veins. They reached her apartment at 4:03 a.m., a narrow brick building in the industrial district, mostly vacant after dark. Max stayed in the car with a laptop, watching traffic cams and scanning scanners. Daniel and Sasha climbed the stairs quickly but cautiously. "Grab only what you need," Daniel whispered. Sasha nodded, slipping into her unit and pulling a backpack from under the bed. Passport, USB drives, burner phone. She moved fast, practiced, prepared. Daniel stood by the door, glancing down the hallway. Then he saw it, a figure, black hoodie, moving fast. Then another. "Sasha," he hissed. "We have company." She froze. "How many?" "At least 2, maybe 3. Just then, Max's voice crackled through the walkie. 2 unmarked SUVs just pulled up license plates registered to a Shell transport company with links to a private security firm. You've got 60 seconds, Max." Daniel pulled a compact Glock from his waistband. He hated guns, but tonight wasn't about principles. Back exit, Sasha whispered. They moved quickly, but the hallway echoed with footsteps, voices. There! A shout. Then gunfire. Bullets ripped through the drywall. Daniel shoved Sasha down the stairwell, returning fire blindly as they fled. Dust exploded behind them as rounds slammed into the concrete. They burst into the alley. Max had already reversed the car, passenger door open. Go, go, go! Max yelled. Daniel dove in after Sasha just as a bullet shattered the rear windshield. Glass rained into the seats as Max floored the accelerator, tires screaming on the wet pavement. The SUVs roared after them. Max cut through a maze of side streets, zigzagging through the sleeping city, barely avoiding trash cans and traffic lights. Sasha crouched low, clutching her bag like it held her soul. Daniel reloaded, breathing hard. Tell me you've got something, he shouted over the engine. Max slammed his hand on the dash. Not yet. We need to get to the safe house. A round punched into the back bumper. Sparks flew. Sasha screamed. They won't stop. They won't have to, Daniel growled. We're not going to run forever. They reached the safe house, an abandoned auto shop at 5:12 a.m. Inside, Max sealed the doors and activated the jamming devices. Daniel pushed a workbench in front of the entrance. Sasha collapsed onto an oil-stained couch, shaking. Are you all right? Daniel asked, kneeling beside her. I think so, she breathed. But they were going to kill me. No, Daniel said. They were going to silence you. Max plugged her USB into his laptop. This is it, he said. Internal memos, timestamps, access logs. Her boss signed off on every transfer. And here's the best part. He turned the laptop to Daniel. On the screen, a list of shell accounts. One of them bore the name R. Stafford Holdings. Daniel stared. Richard Stafford, he whispered. Grant's brother? Max nodded. Follow the money long enough, it always leads home. Sasha spoke up, voice raw. We have to go public, now. Daniel stood slowly. The adrenaline was fading, but the fire in his chest only grew hotter. They tried to kill us tonight, he said. That means they know we're close. So yes, we go public. But not with just part of the story. He looked at Max. We release everything, every detail, every name, every dollar. Max nodded. And Sasha, Daniel added, turning to her, you're not going back into hiding. You're the key witness now. She swallowed hard. Then we finish this. Daniel looked out the cracked window as the first hint of dawn lit the horizon. They had nearly died tonight, but truth had survived, just barely, and now it was ready to strike back. But even as Elijah languished behind bars, branded a criminal by the world, Daniel refused to let the truth die. With the justice system closing its doors and enemies circling like wolves, he turned to the only allies left, those who still believed in what Elijah once stood for. And that's when they found something. Something big enough to blow the entire conspiracy wide open. If it didn't get them killed first. The silence in the holding cell was deafening. Elijah Monroe sat on the edge of the metal cot, wrists resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the dull glow of the hallway light leaking through the bars. His body ached, age, exhaustion, and humiliation weighing heavier than the chains around his ankles. But the worst pain wasn't physical. It was the silence from the world outside. The headlines still screamed his name in disgrace. The public had moved on. The same voices that once called him a moral giant now treated him like a fallen fraud. But Daniel hadn't given up. And tonight, after weeks of silence, Daniel had returned, eyes blazing, hands trembling as he laid out the evidence. The forged identities, the ghost accounts, the whistleblower barely rescued from an ambush, and the name that tied it all together. Richard Stafford. Elijah listened in silence, absorbing every word. Then slowly, he looked up at Daniel. They tried to kill you, Elijah said. Daniel nodded. They failed. There was a long pause. The fluorescent bulb above flickered. Elijah stood slowly, stiffly, and walked to the barred window. Beyond it, the prison yard lay cloaked in darkness. But something inside him was beginning to burn. For years, he had kept his head down. After they destroyed his name the first time, he'd chosen silence over war. He'd thought dignity meant walking away. But now, they had come for the last thing he had as legacy. I won't run anymore, he said quietly. Daniel looked up. I'm done hiding. They buried the truth and tried to bury me with it. But I'm still breathing. Elijah turned, eyes sharpened by fury and purpose. And now I will be heard. Daniel stepped forward, a slow smile breaking across his face. You sure? He asked. Elijah nodded. Let's finish what they started. It began with a single upload. No press release, no teaser, no build-up. Just a nameless video posted anonymously to a forum known for leaking high-profile scandals. The title was plain, Grant Stafford, Internal Meeting, August 12th. Unedited. For the first 2 minutes, the footage was grainy overhead security camera, static hiss in the background, a nondescript boardroom, fluorescent lighting, 5 men in suits seated around a polished oak table. No one said much. Then Grant Stafford leaned forward. The audio clicked into clarity, and everything changed. We need to increase sentencing, he said coldly, fingers steepled. The fines aren't bringing in enough to keep the funds stable. Someone across the table responded, voice blurred. We've already raised them by 15% this quarter. I don't care if it's 15 or 50, Grant snapped. The legal assistance fund won't survive unless we push harder. More citations, harsher penalties, especially on repeat offenders. We need the revenue. Someone asked about the risk of press backlash. Grant leaned back, smirking. Who's going to expose it? Monroe? He's finished. The rest of the city's too afraid to touch me. The room laughed. 10 seconds of silence. Then Grant delivered the final blow. Justice is expensive. Someone has to pay for it. Might as well be them. The room nodded in approval. That single line ignited the fire. Within an hour, the video had been mirrored on dozens of platforms. Within 5, it had over 3 million views. By sunset, it had made national news. Hashtags exploded across social media. Justice for sale. Stafford exposed, free Elijah. Protests erupted outside City Hall before midnight. What had once been scattered murmurs of discontent became a roar that shook the foundations of power. Hundreds gathered with signs. Our pain is not your profit. Judges shouldn't be bankers. Monroe was right. People who had never marched before were now shouting in unison. College students, working-class parents, former defendants who had been bankrupted by Stafford's courtroom fines. This wasn't just a scandal, it was a reckoning. Inside the detention center, Elijah Monroe sat on the edge of his cot, watching the video play on the small screen. A sympathetic guard had slipped into his cell. He saw Grant's face, heard the laughter, the entitlement, the contempt. And then he heard that final line again. Justice is expensive. Someone has to pay for it. Elijah leaned forward slowly, the shadows under his eyes deep and hollow, but something else alive in him now, something sharp, focused, unbreakable. They finally saw it, he whispered. They saw what he had been fighting for his whole life, and now finally they saw the monster wearing the robe. Across the city, Daniel Cruz stood on a rooftop, overlooking the chaos unfolding below. Beside him, Max was glued to his laptop, tracking the video's virality in real time. Beside Max stood Sasha Wynn, pale and exhausted, but victorious. The woman they had nearly died protecting had just helped flip the narrative and expose the truth. Daniel took a breath and checked his phone. Dozens of interview requests, offers of legal aid, whistleblowers volunteering to testify, politicians scrambling to disassociate from Stafford. It was happening. Everything they had risked, everything Elijah had suffered, was finally breaking through. We just cracked the dam, Max said, eyes wide. There's no putting it back. Daniel nodded. Then we flood them. Back in City Hall, the fallout began immediately. Judge Stafford's office released a vague denial. Taken out of context. Manipulated footage. But no one believed it. Not this time. Because truth wasn't just whispered anymore. It was screamed from every screen in America. By morning, a formal judicial review was launched. Stafford's assets were frozen. Protesters surrounded the courthouse. Inside, legal clerks whispered in corridors, unsure if their jobs would survive the storm. The mayor's office issued a statement calling for accountability at all levels of the justice system. Translation: save face. Cut him loose. Even Stafford's own allies were fleeing. But the judge himself, he remained silent, hidden, unreachable. Because deep down, even he knew he was finished. At noon, Daniel held a press conference on the courthouse steps. He didn't wear a suit. He didn't read from a script. He stood with Sasha, with Max, and held the microphone with a steady hand. This is not just about Elijah Monroe, he said. This is about every person who was thrown into debt, prison, or silence by a system that chose profit over people. He paused, letting the cameras roll. Judge Grant Stafford said justice is expensive. We say justice is priceless, and we won't stop until every single person involved in this corruption is held accountable. The crowd erupted. For once, the chants weren't just angry. They were hopeful. Hopeful that something had changed, that the lie had finally been pierced. Later that night, Elijah was moved to a private hospital wing for safety. Protesters stood outside cheering as the van passed. Inside, he watched through the window as strangers, young, old, black, white, held up signs with his name. Not as a criminal, but as a man who had told the truth too soon. The nurse helping him walk asked softly, "How does it feel seeing them out there?" Elijah gave a tired smile. "Feels like breathing after years underwater." The video shattered the silence. But justice isn't handed down through screens, it demands action. And the moment the truth became undeniable, the system had no choice but to respond. What happened next would unfold in the very place where the lies had once ruled supreme. The courtroom. The courtroom was packed shoulder to shoulder, wall to wall. Reporters lined the benches, cameras clicking like gunfire. Protesters filled the corridors outside, chanting Elijah Monroe's name. And at the center of it all sat the man they had once buried back straight, eyes steady, suit crisp, despite the weeks of wrongful imprisonment. Elijah Monroe was not the one on trial anymore. This time, the man in the hot seat was Judge Grant Stafford. He sat just feet away, face pale, jaw clenched, fingers tapping restlessly against the arm of his chair. He'd shown up that morning in his usual tailored suit, expecting to control the narrative, maybe deliver a dramatic statement, spin the investigation, intimidate the media. But the moment the courtroom doors slammed shut, the air shifted. The illusion of control cracked. And then the storm arrived. The FBI agents entered in a wave, dark suits, stern faces, brass badges flashing beneath the courtroom lights. The lead agent strode forward, voice clear and unwavering. "Judge Grant Stafford," he said, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, abuse of judicial power, obstruction of justice, and financial racketeering." The entire courtroom froze. Gasps exploded like thunder. Stafford shot to his feet, outrage pouring from every muscle. "You can't be serious," he roared. "This is my courtroom." "No," the agent replied calmly. "Not anymore." The handcuffs clicked into place. Stafford fought like a cornered animal, wrenching his arms, eyes wild. "You people don't understand," he barked. "You don't know what you've just done." The room was silent. Then Elijah Monroe stood. The man once cast out, disgraced, left to rot in silence, now rose with all the gravity of a gavel slamming down in judgment. His voice was calm, cold, steeled by fire and injustice. "We know exactly what we've done," Elijah said, "and we've only just begun." The weight of those words dropped like a stone in water, rippling through the courtroom, through every camera lens, through every eye watching across the country. Grant's mouth twisted into a snarl, but no more words came. The agents pulled him back, step by step, toward the exit. As he passed Elijah, their eyes locked. Power met resilience. Arrogance met survival. And arrogance blinked first. Outside, the crowd erupted. The glass doors burst open as Stafford was dragged into the daylight, into the roar of people who had once been silenced by his courtroom. Now they watched as he was thrown into the back of a black SUV, the door slamming shut like a cell. Inside the courthouse, the judge presiding over Elijah's release cleared his throat, voice tight with emotion. After reviewing the new evidence presented by federal investigators, and in light of the Department of Justice's findings, he said, all charges against Elijah Monroe are hereby dismissed. The words rang through the chamber like a hymn. Daniel Cruz leaned forward, unable to stop the grin breaking across his face. Max pounded the bench with both fists, cheering. Sasha wiped a tear from her eye. Dozens of Elijah's former students stood, applauding. But Elijah? He remained seated for a moment, letting it sink in. Not the vindication, not the headlines, but the truth finally given breath. Then slowly he stood. The room followed. Outside, the cameras waited, microphones extended like spears. Elijah stepped into the sunlight, blinking against the flash of bulbs, and faced the crowd. A reporter shouted, "Judge Monroe, what do you have to say now that you're a free man?" He paused. Then, with the same fire that once silenced entire courtrooms, he spoke. "I was never the one who needed to be freed." The truth was silence, then a tidal wave of applause. That night, the country changed. News channels aired the footage on repeat Grant Stafford being dragged from his own courtroom. Analysts dissected every word. Former staffers came forward. More names were dropped. Investigations launched. The Monroe Files, as the leaked evidence was now called, became the centerpiece of a federal overhaul into judicial corruption. But Elijah? He didn't go home to celebrate. He went back to the old courthouse, alone. The building was quiet now, empty, ghost-like. He stepped into the room where he had once passed down verdicts, where he had once believed in the system enough to fight for it. He stood behind the old bench, let his hand rest on the wood. "This was never about revenge," he whispered. "It was about remembering what justice is supposed to feel like." Behind him, Daniel entered quietly. "They're calling you a hero," he said. "I'm not. I know. But you stood when no one else would." Elijah turned. "You stood first," Daniel smiled. "You taught me how." They walked out together, side by side, past the shattered legacy of a broken judge, into the flickering light of something new. Hope, real, raw, earned, not given by the system, taken back from it. And Elijah Monroe, once a man the world tried to erase, now stood at the center of a revolution that had only just begun. The storm had passed, but the scars remained. In the weeks after Grant Stafford's arrest, in the nationwide fallout that followed, Elijah Monroe became the face of a movement he never asked to lead. The news networks begged for interviews. Universities offered him honorary doctorates. Senators called him a symbol of moral resilience. But when the governor offered to reinstate his judgeship, Elijah gave the only answer he could. No, he didn't need the robe. He didn't want the bench. He had worn both before, and still, they had tried to bury him alive. Justice, he told them, doesn't come from a gavel. It comes from people who know their rights and refuse to be silenced. And so, instead of returning to power, he returned to the people. In a rundown community center on the east side of the city, just blocks from where he'd grown up, Elijah opened the doors to a new kind of courtroom. No bailiffs, no prosecutors, no verdicts. Just folding chairs, whiteboards, and a voice that refused to die. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, under flickering fluorescent lights, he stood in front of crowded rooms filled with teens, young parents, ex-cons, and day laborers. People who had never been taught how to fight back. He taught them the basics of the law, how to navigate traffic court, how to defend against eviction, how to read a warrant, how to demand a public defender. Your voice, he told them, is your first line of defense. Word spread fast. What started as 15 kids turned into 50, then 100. And Elijah Monroe, once silenced and shamed, now had standing room only. Meanwhile, Daniel Cruz wasn't resting either. Fueled by rage, redemption, and the fire that only comes from watching justice nearly be destroyed, he took the millions raised in crowdfunding after the Stafford scandal and used it to build something permanent. The Monroe Foundation, a nonprofit legal team staffed by young lawyers, retired judges, activists, and students, dedicated to one mission: uncover every wrongful conviction, every buried truth, and every voice the system tried to crush. They launched with 10 volunteers. Within a month, they had over 50 attorneys offering pro bono work. The cases poured in like water breaking through a dam, and the first target was obvious: Stafford's old docket. Dozens of victims came forward, people who'd lost their homes to excessive fines, mothers whose children had been sentenced unfairly, fathers who'd served years for crimes they didn't commit. Daniel built a war room. Photos of victims lined the walls. Court transcripts covered whiteboards. Teams worked around the clock, re-examining old evidence. locating forgotten witnesses, tracking down buried documents. And slowly the system began to crack again, only this time in the right direction. The first overturned case was a man named Malik Rowe, sentenced to 5 years for resisting arrest during a traffic stop. Video recovered by Monroe Foundation attorneys showed he had never resisted. He had simply asked, "Why am I being pulled over?" Malik walked free after 3 years in prison. Then came Gloria Santos, convicted for fraud after cashing a check that wasn't hers. Turns out the bank teller who testified against her had a history of falsifying ID confirmations. Gloria's conviction was vacated. One by one, the dominoes fell. 23 cases overturned in the first 4 months, dozens more under review, each one a story, a name, a person the system had once forgotten. Not anymore. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Daniel visited Elijah at the community center. The classroom was packed, young people scribbling notes, asking questions, learning their power. Elijah saw Daniel in the back and raised a hand. "That's enough for tonight," he said to the crowd. "But remember, justice doesn't live in buildings. It lives in your choices. Go make good ones." The students applauded, some clapping Elijah on the shoulder as they filed out. Daniel stepped forward. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "We just got a judge to reopen Stafford's sentencing for Antonio Briggs, the kid who got 10 years for shoplifting a stereo." Elijah's brow lifted. "That was, what, 2013? Daniel nodded. "He's still inside, but not for much longer." They sat, tired but smiling. "You ever think we'd get here?" Daniel asked. Elijah leaned back in his chair. "Number. But I always hoped someone would." Daniel paused. "I think you were that someone." Elijah shook his head. "I just survived long enough to see the next generation fight smarter." They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the city outside like a soft drum. Then Elijah added, "They called me a hypocrite, a fraud, a thief. But the truth stayed standing." Daniel looked at him. "And so did you." The newspapers moved on. The cameras faded. But in neighborhoods and courtrooms across the country, the fire kept burning. Young people citing case law in traffic court. Mothers demanding public defenders. Ex-inmates volunteering at legal clinics. Judges double-checking their own rulings, afraid to end up like Stafford. Justice was no longer a distant echo. It was a living, breathing movement. Because Elijah hadn't returned to the bench, he'd returned to the people. And that decision may have changed more lives than any verdict ever could. The city pulsed around them. It was a warm afternoon in late spring, the kind that carried the scent of rain-soaked concrete and blooming magnolias. Cars hummed along the boulevard. Children laughed in the distance. The courthouse, once a symbol of silence and fear, now stood across the street as a monument to something reclaimed. Elijah Monroe sat on a wooden bench outside a modest park near the community center, his cane resting at his side, his eyes following the steady flow of people walking by. Next to him sat Daniel Cruz, his jaw still scarred from a past ambush, but his gaze sharp with purpose. On Elijah's other side was Paul Greer, the former assistant district attorney who had risked his career to speak the truth. 3 men, 3 witnesses to a battle no one else truly understood. They watched as families passed, as students debated around food trucks, as old veterans played chess under the gazebo. The city was alive, and for once it felt right. Paul exhaled slowly, leaning back. "You ever think we'd make it to this day?" Elijah didn't respond at first. His eyes were locked on a young black woman pushing a stroller, followed by 2 boys chasing each other in circles. Laughter echoed, bouncing off buildings that once held only the cold echoes of judgment. Then he spoke low, firm, without hesitation. "They tried to erase me," he said. "They tried to scrub me from court records, from history books, from memory." His voice deepened. "But justice," Elijah said, eyes narrowing as the sun dipped behind a skyline he once thought he'd never see again, "cannot be erased." Daniel looked at him with reverence. "You didn't just survive, Elijah. You changed the way the system breathes." Elijah's hand rested on his cane. He gave a faint smile, but it carried the weight of decades. "Only because you pulled me out of the grave they dug for me," he said quietly. "You and the truth." Paul nodded slowly. There's still more to do. Grant may be behind bars, but the system he helped build isn't gone yet. I know, Elijah replied, but now the world is watching. They sat in silence for a while, letting the wind carry the weight of everything unspoken. The betrayals, the scars, the quiet victories. Across the park, a group of teenagers gathered near the community center's steps, laughing as they flipped through notebooks and pages of handouts from one of Elijah's civic law classes. One of the girls glanced over at the bench where he sat and whispered something to her friend. They both smiled, shy but proud. Daniel saw it and smirked. "You've got fans, Judge." "I've got survivors," Elijah corrected. "And maybe, just maybe, future fighters." Suddenly, Paul pointed across the street. "Look." A small black boy, 8, maybe 9, sat cross-legged under the shade of a tree near the sidewalk. He wore a hand-me-down jacket, shoes too big for his feet, but his eyes were locked on the book in his hands like it was the most precious thing in the world. He wasn't playing or shouting. He was reading, and on the cover of the book, bold letters read, "Civic Law for Citizens, Knowing Your Rights." And beneath the title was a portrait. Elijah. Not the mugshot the press once circulated, not the courtroom sketch of a defeated man, but a proud, dignified photo him in his later years, staring ahead with calm defiance, wearing no robe, no title, only truth. The boy's finger traced the edge of the page. Then he turned it, slowly, carefully. Elijah's chest rose. He couldn't look away. That book hadn't existed a year ago. It was Daniel's idea, a tool for schools, shelters, youth centers, designed to explain the law in plain language, written with Elijah's teachings at its core. The fact that it was being read now, on a quiet afternoon by a child who had never seen the inside of a courtroom, was more powerful than any verdict ever rendered. Daniel whispered, "That's it, isn't it? That's the whole reason we fought." Elijah didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat tightened. He blinked slowly, watching the boy, seeing not just one child but hundreds, thousands, kids who would grow up knowing the difference between authority and justice, between punishment and fairness, between silence and speaking truth. They couldn't erase him. They couldn't erase what he stood for, because now the future was reading, and it remembered his name. If this story moved you, if you believe justice should never be silenced and truth deserves to be heard, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. Every click helps us bring more untold voices to light, and your support fuels this journey toward justice. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and join us in standing up for what's right. Like, subscribe, share, because justice begins with awareness, and awareness begins with you.